Chris in Oklahoma is on talking about divine inspiration, what it is. Chris, welcome. You're on with Matt and Andrew.
Hi, thank you very much for having me on. I just had a question with regards to atheism and their thoughts of inspiration. Is it possible? And for me, my background is I'm a Southern Baptist, but I have since started investigating my own faith, and I've I'm leaning more heavily towards being agnostic and admitting that I just don't know. But having such a deep family, connections with believing in a God or in God, the Judeo-Christian God, it's difficult to let go of something like that. And so, I've often speculated, in my own head about inspiration and the possibility that maybe this divinity or whatever we want to call it, has some connection to inspiration and to those times in history and in our lives where some kind of leap happens where we just go from some kind of primitive tools and primitive thoughts to the age of enlightenment, and then to the age of the information technology age. You know what I'm saying? There seems to be throughout history some sort of a leap that happens, and I'm just wondering if it's possible that you could say, that maybe that was some kind of an impersonal divine spark of inspiration.
Go ahead, Andrew.
I mean, I would say no. I think you're glossing over a significant portion of history going from tools to stone tools to the Enlightenment, right? I mean, thousands of generations. The progress of humanity is fairly slow. But then in terms of technology, the graph looks like this, and then technology builds on technology. And so, you kind of get this exponential growth when it comes to that. I way back in undergrad, when I got my bachelor's in neuroscience. And, you talk about these sort of like leaps of logic, and all of a sudden you have this cascade of thoughts, and you've drawn this connection that nobody else has drawn. It's really exciting. But none of that is indicative of something that is divine or supernatural. I think it's first of all, I think I should have said this first, Chris. I'm sorry. I think it's really great that you're questioning and you're having the courage to confront this, even in the face of all the emotional connections that you have to your religion and your God, especially as they tie in with your family. I think it's really courageous that you're out there questioning those things. And I tend to think that this is kind of one of the last vestiges that will fall for a lot of people. But unless you can tie that for me in some specific way to something that is divine. I would say that that's not. And I would also just one final point, and then I'll kick it to Matt. Like, in terms of like looking at the history of humanity, one of the most retrogressive forces that we know of are the forces that preach God and religion. I mean, they opposed Ben Franklin's lightning bolt because it was against God's will. They opposed vaccinations against God's will. I mean, historically, just about every single scientific or technological advancement we have seen has been opposed by religious forces. Not all of them, but where the opposition is, it tends to be religious. That is a broad brush that I'm painting with, but I think it stands.
And I'll chime in just for a couple of things, because I want to get back to you, Chris. And by the way, I get to correct Andrew on something, because he said Ben Franklin's lightning bolt, and I think the problem was Ben Franklin's lightning rod.
Yes, that is correct. Yeah.
But I think we're talking about two different things, because when I hear the term divine inspiration, I think of more along the lines of like the ancient Greeks and muses of, inspiring art and inspiring goodwill and all those things. And I think that sort of labeled divine inspiration. I still don't see any reason to think it's divine. I think it's just the way our brain works. But you, Chris, were talking about like seemingly intuitive leaps where we're mired in some sort of technological age, and then boom, there's an enlightenment, or boom, we get this, we get computers, and the next thing you know, we're holding them. We got computers in the sides of our glasses with a display and all this stuff in just no time. I mean, it's only 162 years ago, roughly, that Darwin published on the origin of species. But here's my question. If you were to try to argue that those intuitive leaps were from God, How does that make sense? Because if God wanted us to have a particular technological understanding of the world, he could have created us that way with that level of understanding. And if we weren't getting to it fast enough, he could have created us smart enough to sort that out on our own. What is the process that God decides to create an agrarian society with no technology if he really wants us to have cell phones? It doesn't make sense that, oh, they've been floundering around there in shit for so long. Let's give them a little technological boost. It doesn't make sense with what God's goals are, especially, and I, as a former Southern Baptist, I'm right there with you, where this life is like dirty rags, and essentially all we're waiting for is the next life to come. That's the big one. What difference does technology make, or a medical science, or improvements? Why have any of those things? It doesn't make sense to me to create a system like this and then divinely inspire technological or medical leaps and things like that.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. That really does. I wish I had an answer for that.
I wish anybody did.
Wondering,
Yeah, I mean, I've been hosting this show for 16 years. There's a lot of things that I wish people had an answer to, but I appreciate you, Chris, in that, and by the way, no matter where you end up, I'm with Andrew. The fact that you're asking questions is a good thing. The fact that you're acknowledging, hey, I don't have an answer to this. That's the reason I'm no longer a Southern Baptist. And questions like this, that when I realized not only do I not have an answer for these things, but no preacher I've ever talked to has had an answer for these. No religious advisors had an answer to these. It's not like there's a Nobel Prize for discovering what God wants. I mean, we have books, what men want, what women want. Where's the book that what God wants, and how? And I'm sure there's probably one out there, but it's written by a human being who's demonstrated no more expertise on God than me or Andrew.
Right, exactly. And I've often thought to myself too, if the Judeo-Christian God actually, were as described to us as a personal God, why not just simply, him hand deliver the book to us, or just reveal himself to us face to face, like it's supposedly the Moses.
Why hasn't he come on this show? I mean, I've been doing the show for 16 years. God is welcome to show up on this show whenever the hell he wants to.
And the internet's got to exist wherever God is, right?
It must.
I mean, if he's everywhere. I mean, Chris, you're asking really great questions, and I just keep doing that. And don't be. To me, one of the best things is being able to say I don't know, and then looking for an answer, and sometimes not being comfortable, or sometimes being comfortable with not knowing. I think that's one of the emotional ties that religion really binds people to it. You get that certainty, and the world's just not a certain place. Neither is the universe.
So that leads me to my second question, though, with regards to being called an atheist or an agnostic. Currently, I'm leaning heavily towards calling myself an agnostic, but because of my background, it's difficult to try and explain that to friends and family that you've grown up with. And I'm just curious, though. One of the arguments that they put forth to me was, how can you be an atheist unless you have all knowledge? You'd have to basically be God to be able to disprove that God exists. And that's the reason why I lean towards agnostic, because at least there I can say, I don't know. I don't know that a omnipotent, all-powerful, God exists, but just the opposite. I don't know that he doesn't exist. I mean,
neither do I. Neither do I.
Nor do I.
Chris, nor does Andrew, nor does anybody else. Atheism doesn't mean you're absolutely sure that there's no God. It doesn't mean that you can prove there's no God. Atheist just means you're not convinced there is a God at a minimum. You may also be convinced that particular gods or some gods or all gods don't exist, but you don't have to have all knowledge. And here's, I think for me, I would tell you, first of all, don't worry so much about the label. I have a video up on my Atheist Debates project that's about whether or not you call yourself an atheist or an agnostic. For me, there's theist and non-theist, and there's nothing in between. Just like you either, guilty, not guilty is your vote. But if you vote not guilty, that doesn't mean you're convinced that the person's innocent. It just means that you're not convinced that they are guilty, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so I would look that up, and I would also recommend that you look up something called the argument, the argument from divine hiddenness, because that is, I think, the strongest argument against the notion of God. However, even if you don't find that one compelling enough to conclude there is no God, that argument, along with many others, puts you in a position where you can definitely say, I am not convinced a God exists. And if you're not convinced a God exists, then you can't be a theist. You're not a Southern Baptist. You're not, all these other things. And whether you call yourself, I get annoyed because of these battles about, oh, you're not an atheist, you're an agnostic. And I'm like, no, let me explain this. Let me explain this particular, and I go over it over and over. At the end of the day, I do not give a fuck what anybody calls themselves, because when all is said and done, I'm not convinced a God exists. Andrew is not convinced a God exists. And whatever you want to call us, if you spend all your time arguing about whether are you an atheist, are you an agnostic, when those two things are not mutually exclusive, you can be an agnostic theist, you can be a Gnostic atheist, etc. If you spend your time focused on that, that's a distraction. When the truth is, I don't believe in a God.
So
yeah.
I have a couple thoughts. Go ahead, Chris.
Well, I was just going to say I don't have any knowledge on other forms of God other than the Judeo-Christian version that is based off of their interpretation of the Bible. But if I go and I say, well, I don't believe in the Judeo-Christian God, Elohim or Yahweh or whatever you want to call him, what's left for me at that point? Is a search for other gods, or just to simply say, you know what, if there's a God or a divine source out there, it or he or she will find me.
Yeah. It's not your fault that you can't have exhaustive knowledge of everything in the universe. But if somebody said to you, do you believe in fairies? What would you say?
Oh, no, I wouldn't even hesitate. No, I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so if somebody says, do you believe in fairies? And you say no, and they say, hang on, are you sure you're not just agnostic about fairies? Or do you actually believe that fairies don't exist? What's your answer then?
I'm pretty sure that fairies don't exist.
There you go.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, when you have no more information about fairies, because you haven't been to every planet, you haven't explored the entire universe, you don't have exhaustive knowledge of the universe. If you can say that about fairies, then it shouldn't be any harder to say it about a God. It is harder. It is absolutely more difficult for almost every human being that's grown up in a world where religion has this preferential treatment and it becomes the de facto thing, but it shouldn't be.
I agree completely with what Matt just said, and I was gonna do the same thing, but with leprechauns. I'm partial to the non-existence of leprechauns myself. Chris, I just want to add too, like I think, and to Matt's point, where we constantly are having these conversations. I have been told by, I was laughing when you asked this question because I was thinking back to the debate that I had a couple weeks ago that Matt was kind enough to critique, where I have been told by so many diehard Christians that I am not an atheist, and I am kind of convinced now that label is a threat to their entire worldview. The fact that an atheist can exist and be a happy person without religion and without a God is more threatening to them than many other things. And so they say we don't exist. If I have to get technical, I call myself an atheist, and I also call myself an agnostic. Agnostic, I think, is a question of knowledge. I'll never have perfect knowledge about anything. And atheism is more that question of belief. So they're two different and not mutually exclusive things. You can certainly be both. They also have that emotional label that I was just talking, or that emotional weight on the label that I was just talking about. So I choose to, when I publicly identify, call myself an atheist, in part to help tear down that stigma and say, yeah, you can be like a happy, nice person and not have religion or a God. And it's freeing. It really is just freeing.
I hope those
mind-force manacles.
Yeah, I hope this has all been helpful, Chris. I got to move on to other callers, but by all means, call back and check in with us. Let us know, where you come down, or if you have other questions or thoughts on it.
I sure appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.